The stallion put a groom through the fence rail on a morning in late autumn, and by the time the household finished speaking of it, the animal had a name it never asked for. They called him the Widowmaker before noon. The groom lived, though his arm would never again close fully around a bridle, and the story of how the black horse reared and struck and dragged him 20 feet through frost-hardened ground travelled from the stable to the kitchen to the village inn before the surgeon had finished his work. Men who had never stood within 30 feet of the horse spoke of him with the certainty of witnesses. Women crossed themselves at the mention of his name, and in the stable itself, where the truth of the matter actually lived, the head groom nailed a second bolt to the stall door and told every boy under his charge that the animal was to be fed from a pole and never under any circumstance touched by hand. The horse himself stood in the dark of that stall through the whole of it, ears flat, sides heaving, a creature built along lines that suggested speed and violence in equal measure, black from muzzle to hoof-save, for a single ragged patch of white above his left eye that the groom said looked like a crack in a church window. He did not know why the world had gone the way it had. He knew only that hands reached for him with rope and chain, that voices came sharp and fast, that pain had followed touch so many times that touch itself had become the thing to fear. A creature does not reason his way to violence. He arrives there the way a man arrives at silence, through repetition, through the slow closing of every door that once stood open. The Duke of Rowancross had not seen the stallion since the day the horse arrived at Ashfell, 3 years past, a gift purchased in his brother's name and never collected because his brother had died before the ship carrying the animal reached English shores. Edmund had ordered him for the hunt season, a black Hanoverian out of a Prussian sire, meant to be the finest thing in the county stable. He had died of a fever in the spring. Quick and quiet, and entirely without the drama that his younger brother Julian had always assumed death would carry with it, and the horse had arrived that autumn to a house already wearing black, delivered to a stable master who did not know what to do with a creature nobody had ordered, and everybody now resented. Julian had gone to see him once. He remembered a dark shape backed into the far corner of a paddock, refusing every approach, and he remembered thinking that the horse looked the way he felt, and he had not gone back. Elsie Corbin knew none of this history when she carried the slop pail past the stable yard on a Tuesday morning, with her apron still damp from the scullery, and her mind fixed entirely on whether there would be enough butter for the dowager's toast. She was 17 years old, and had worked in the kitchens of Ashfell since she was 12. Brought in from the poorhouse in Selby by a cook, who needed a girl willing to scrub before dawn, and had found, in Elsie, a girl willing to do a great deal more than that without complaint. She had no family beyond the other servants, no dowry, no expectations beyond the modest hope of one day becoming a cook herself if she lived long enough, and burned herself rarely enough to keep her hands presentable. She was not beautiful in the way the housemaids sometimes gossiped about beauty, comparing themselves to portraits and to visiting ladies, but she had a stillness to her that the older cook had noticed early, a way of moving through a room without disturbing it, and stillness, in a kitchen full of shouting, was its own kind of gift. Her days followed a shape so familiar she could have walked them blind. She rose before the other girls to coax the range fire back to life, carried water until her shoulders ached in a way she no longer noticed, and spent the long middle hours scouring pots blackened by dinners she would never taste a portion of. The other kitchen girls liked her well enough, though they teased her gently for her habit of talking to the hens as she scattered their feed, and for the way she saved the burnt edges of bread for whatever creature happened to be wandering the yard rather than eating them herself. She did not mind the teasing. She had learned early that a girl without family had to build her small comforts out of whatever materials were left lying about, a kind word here, a warm corner there, and she had grown skilled at finding warmth in places other people overlooked entirely. She heard the horse before she saw him. A sound came from the stable that she had never heard an animal make, something between a scream and a groan, low and furious, and beneath it the crack of hooves against wood loud enough that she felt it in the ground through her boots. 2 grooms stood outside the stall door with a coil of rope between them, arguing in the clipped, frightened voices of men who did not want to go first. She should have walked on. The pail was heavy, and the morning was short, and nothing about the scene in front of her had anything to do with her work. But she set the pail down against the wall without deciding to, the way a person sometimes finds their feet carrying them toward a sound before their mind has agreed to the errand, and she came to stand at the edge of the yard and looked through the gap in the stall boards at the horse inside. He was pressed into the corner of the stall, with his ears back and his eyes showing white at the edges. A great black shape trembling with a kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the body. One of the grooms saw her and told her sharply to get back, that the beast had already put a man through a fence and would as soon put a girl through one, and she stepped back as told. But she did not stop looking. She had grown up around animals that other people had given up on. The poorhouse kept a mule that bit anyone who came near until Elsie, at 9 years old, had simply sat near its stall each evening without asking anything of it, and within a season the mule had taken bread from her hand while it still shied from every other soul on the grounds. She did not think of this as a skill. She thought of it, if she thought of it at all, as patience. And patience was the one thing the poorhouse had taught her in abundance. The grooms gave up on the rope by mid-morning and reported to the stable master that the horse could not be handled that day, and the stable master, a broad man named Hollis, with little patience left for a horse he had never wanted responsibility for, said that if the animal could not be handled it could go to the knacker within the week and be done with, and good riddance to a beast that ate money and gave nothing back but broken bones. He said this loudly enough that half the stable yard heard it, and Elsie, carrying the pail back toward the kitchen, heard it too, and something in her chest went tight and cold in a way she did not examine closely. She did not sleep well that night, turning the stable master's words over in her mind long after the other girls in the attic room had gone quiet around her. She thought of the mule at the poorhouse, of how close it had come, in its first furious weeks, to being sold off to a carter who cared nothing for gentleness, and of the particular unfairness of a world that so often mistook a frightened creature's defence for its true nature, and punished the defence rather than asking after the fear beneath it. She had felt something of that same unfairness in her own bones more than once, in the early months after her parents died, when the poorhouse matron had called her sullen for a silence that had actually been grief wearing a smaller, more manageable face. She did not decide that night to help the horse. She only found, when morning came, that she had already decided, somewhere beneath conscious thought, and that the decision had simply been waiting for her to notice it. Hollis was not a cruel man, only a tired one, saddled with a beast he had never chosen and a household grief he had no authority to address. He had managed the Ashfell stables for 11 years and prided himself on knowing every animal in his care down to its smallest habits. Which horse favoured the near side of the paddock, which mare disliked thunder more than her stablemates, and the black stallion's arrival had unsettled that pride from the very first week. He had tried the methods that had always worked before, firm hands, a raised voice when necessary, the slow wearing down of resistance through repetition, and none of it had touched the animal at all, had if anything driven him further into the corner of himself where nothing living could reach him. By the time Elsie began her evening visits, Hollis had privately concluded that the horse was simply broken beyond use, a conclusion he found easier to live with than the alternative, that he himself had failed to find the right door. She thought about the horse through the whole of her afternoon work, through the peeling and the scrubbing and the endless carrying of water, and when the kitchen finally quieted after supper and the cook had gone to her rest, Elsie took a heel of bread from the bin, the kind meant for the pigs, and walked out into the blue dark toward the stable. She told herself she only meant to look. She told herself this several times, the way a person repeats a small lie until it grows sturdy enough to walk on. The stable at night was a different country from the stable by day, quiet but for the shift and breathe of animals settling into sleep, lit only by a single lamp Hollis left burning near the tack room out of habit rather than need. The black horse's stall sat at the very end, and even from a distance she could see him standing rigid in the dark, not sleeping, watching the door the way a man watches a door he expects trouble to come through. She stopped well short of the stall and lowered herself to sit on an overturned bucket, close enough to be within his sight, but far enough, she judged, that he would not feel crowded, and she said nothing at all. She only sat. An hour passed this way. She did not approach, did not speak, did not so much as look at him directly for long stretches, letting her gaze drift instead to the lamp, to her own hands, to the rafters where a barn owl occasionally shifted. Slowly, so slowly that she almost missed the change, the stiffness went out of the horse's neck. He shifted his weight from one hind leg to the other. He lowered his head an inch, then two, until his nose nearly brushed the straw, and though he did not sleep, something in him unclenched that she recognized because she had felt it herself, on the nights after her parents died and the poorhouse first swallowed her whole. The slow unclenching of a body that has decided, against all its better judgment, that it might be permitted to rest. She came back the following night, and the night after that, always at the same hour, always to the same bucket, always in silence. On the fourth night she set the heel of bread on the ground just inside the stall door, well short of where the horse stood, and left without waiting to see if he would take it. In the morning it was gone. She told no one. She was not certain, if she had tried to explain it, that she could have made the reasons sound like anything other than foolishness. A scullery girl imagining a bond with a horse that had broken a grown man's arm. And foolishness was a luxury the girls at Ashfell could not generally afford. The weather turned through those first weeks the way it always turned in that part of Yorkshire. The gold of early autumn giving way to a grey that settled over the moor and did not lift, and Elsie came to know the stable in every version of that changing light, the last low sun through the high window, the blue dark of true evening. The particular hush that fell when frost first touched the yard, and every animal in the building seemed to draw its breath in at once. She learned to read the horse the way she had once learned to read weather, small signs building toward larger ones. The flick of an ear that meant a sound had startled him before she herself had noticed it. The way his tail stilled completely when he had decided, for the length of an evening, that nothing in the stable required his vigilance, she began to feel, though she would not have said the word aloud to anyone, something like tenderness for a creature the rest of the county still spoke of only in fear, and she began to suspect, somewhere in the honest part of herself she rarely examined too closely, that the tenderness was no longer only for the horse. Julian rode out to the stable himself in the second week of the horse's confinement, summoned by Hollis with a message that made clear the animal's days were numbered unless the Duke wished to intervene. An intervention would cost more coin and patience than Hollis believed the horse was worth. Julian had put off the visit twice already, telling himself he had estate matters that mattered more than the disposition of a horse he had never wanted. But the truth, closer to the bone, was that he did not wish to stand in front of the last thing his brother had ever ordered and feel whatever it was he was certain he would feel. Grief had made him efficient in the 2 years since Edmund's death. He signed papers, he approved repairs. He walked the grounds each morning with the steady, contained bearing of a man who had decided that feeling anything too loudly was a kind of failure, and the estate had come to regard him as cold for it, a judgment he did not entirely dispute. He arrived at the stable in the grey hour before the grooms began their morning work, wanting to see the animal without an audience, and found instead a scullery maid asleep on an overturned bucket outside the black horse's stall, her head tipped against the boards, a basket of half-eaten bread beside her feet. The horse stood close to the door, closer than Julian had ever seen him stand to anything human, his head low, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair that had escaped the girl's cap. Julian stood in the aisle for a long moment without announcing himself, watching a scene that made no sense against everything Hollis had reported, and when he finally spoke, low, asking what in God's name she thought she was doing. The girl woke with a start that startled the horse in turn, and the horse threw his head up and backed hard into the far corner of the stall, the fragile piece of the morning gone in an instant. She scrambled to her feet and dropped into a curtsy so quick and so mortified that Julian nearly laughed despite himself, and she began apologising in a rush, for the bucket, for sleeping where she had no business sleeping, for the bread taken from the pig bin, for existing at all in a place a duke had just walked into. He held up a hand and told her to stop, that he had no complaint about the bread, and asked instead, with a genuine and unfamiliar curiosity that surprised him as much as it surprised her, how long she had been coming here, and what exactly she believed she was doing with a horse that had already put a man in the surgeon's care. She told him the truth, because she could not think of a lie fast enough, and because something about the quiet of the stable and the early hour made honesty feel like the only available currency. She told him about the mule at the poorhouse. She told him that the horse was not vicious, only frightened, and that frightened animals and frightened people were not so very different. They only wanted to know that the next hand reaching toward them would not hurt. She said this last part, and then flushed, aware that she had said more than a kitchen girl ought to say to a duke, and looked at her boots and waited to be dismissed. He found himself, in the silence that followed, unwilling to give the dismissal she expected. He had come to the stable that morning, braced for the practical business of confirming a dangerous animal fit for disposal, a task he had rehearsed on the ride over in the clipped, efficient language he used for every unpleasant estate matter. And he had not prepared himself for the sight of a servant asleep beside a beast that had, by every account he trusted, nearly killed a man. Something in the arrangement offended his sense of order and, in the same breath, quietly undid it. He was a man who had spent 2 years building his composure out of predictable outcomes, and here was an outcome nobody could have predicted. A girl with straw in her hair, who spoke of frightened horses and frightened people in the same steady sentence, and he did not yet understand why he found himself reluctant to walk away from it. He did not dismiss her. He looked past her instead, at the horse, who had settled somewhat in the corner but kept his eyes fixed on the girl rather than on the man in the doorway. And Julian felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name, a loosening around an old ache he had grown so used to carrying that he had nearly forgotten it as separate from himself. He asked her name. She told him Elsie Corbin, and he said it back once, quietly, as though testing whether it fit the person standing in front of him, and then he told her, in the flat voice he used for estate business, that she could keep coming to the stable in the evenings if Hollis had no objection, and that he would see Hollis had no objection. Word of the arrangement moved through the servants' hall within a day, as word always did at Ashfell, and it did not move kindly. The other kitchen girls found it first amusing, and then, when Elsie continued to disappear each evening while they mended and gossiped by the fire, something closer to suspicious. Mrs. Fenn the cook warned her plainly that a scullery girl seen too often near the family's business, horse or no horse, was a scullery girl inviting trouble she would not enjoy, and that dukes did not make companions of kitchen maids without a reason that rarely ended well for the maid. Elsie took the warning seriously enough to keep her visits brief and her manner. Whenever she crossed paths with Julian in the yard, carefully unremarkable. But she did not stop going. Word of the horse's slow recovery travelled beyond the estate walls, despite the household's efforts to keep the matter quiet, and the village at the bottom of the drive, which had spent a full year embellishing the tale of the groom's broken arm into something closer to a ghost story, found itself with a stranger and more difficult tale to embellish instead. Some said a witch had been brought in from the moor to charm the animal calm. Others insisted more plausibly that the girl was simply gifted in the old way some country families still spoke of quietly, a gift for gentling that ran in certain bloodlines and skipped others entirely. The truth, unglamorous and entirely without magic, interested the village far less than the rumour, and Elsie, hearing fragments of the talk second-hand from the other kitchen girls, found it easier to let the rumour stand than to explain the plainer truth that patience, offered without demand, would calm almost any frightened creature given enough time. The horse began to change by degrees so small that only 2 people in the household were watching closely enough to see them. He allowed the bread to be placed nearer his feet, then took it while she still knelt an arm's length away, then, on a night in the 2nd month, lowered his great head far enough that his breath moved warm across her open palm before he took the bread from it directly. His lips soft and careful in a way that undid something in her chest she had not expected an animal to reach. She did not touch him that night. She understood, without anyone teaching her the principle in words, that trust built through offering was sturdier than trust taken through reaching, and so she let him come to the edge of contact again and again before she ever let her own hand cross the remaining distance. Julian found reasons to be present for more of these evenings than duty required. He told himself in the beginning that he was merely satisfying his curiosity about an expensive animal he had nearly ordered destroyed, and there was truth enough in that explanation to let him believe it for a while. He began arriving earlier, staying later, standing at first in the stable doorway, and then, as the weeks passed, sitting on a second bucket a respectful distance from Elsie's own, watching the horse the way a man watches something he does not yet trust himself to want. They spoke little at first, the silence of the stable proving contagious, but silence between 2 people who choose to remain in a room together says a great deal on its own, and by the middle of winter the silences between Julian and Elsie had become companionable rather than merely polite. He told her about Edmund on a night in December, the words arriving without his permission the way confession sometimes does when a person has held something too long and too carefully. He told her that the horse had been his brother's, ordered and never claimed, and that some part of him had avoided the stable for 3 years, because looking at the animal felt like looking at the last unfinished thing his brother had ever wanted, a debt Julian did not know how to settle. He told her that Edmund had been the warmer of the 2 of them, the one their mother had always preferred without meaning to show it, and that Julian had spent the 2 years since his brother's death trying to be competent in a way that would make the loss of the warmer brother less costly to the estate, and that he had not, until this winter, considered whether it had also made the loss more costly to himself. Elsie listened without offering the easy comforts a person of higher station might have expected from her, the assurances that time healed all things, or that his brother would be proud, phrases she had heard said to grieving families in the village, and had always suspected did more for the speaker than the listener. She said instead that grief did not need to be settled to be carried, that some debts were not the kind that closed, and that the horse in front of them did not need Julian to have solved anything, only to keep showing up, which he had done, evening after evening, whatever his reasons. He looked at her for a long moment after she said this, in the low lamp light with the horse breathing steady behind the boards, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, though both of them carried it back to their separate quarters of the house that night with equal weight. Other evenings followed in a similar quiet register, each one adding some small new understanding to the growing store between them. She learned that he disliked the taste of tea gone cold, and drank it anyway rather than trouble a servant twice in one evening, a habit she found herself, without any instruction from Mrs. Fenn, quietly correcting whenever she carried a tray near his study. He learned that she had taught herself to read from a single battered primer the poorhouse schoolmaster had given her, and that she still sounded out unfamiliar words under her breath, a habit she was faintly embarrassed by, and that he found, though he never said so aloud, entirely without fault. They spoke of small things mostly, the weather, the horse's steadily improving appetite, a fox that had taken to raiding the kitchen garden, and it was precisely the smallness of these exchanges that made them feel, to both of them, like something worth protecting. Neither spoke of rank in those evenings, nor of the great gulf a village and a county alike would have insisted stood between them, and the absence of that subject was its own kind of honesty. A silent agreement to let the stable remain the one place at Ashfell where a duke and a kitchen girl could simply be two people learning to trust the same frightened animal, and, without quite admitting it, learning to trust each other in the process. The Dowager Duchess, Julian's Aunt Augusta, who had managed the household since Julian's mother's death, and regarded the maintenance of proper distance between the family and the staff as one of the central pillars of civilization, noticed the pattern of his evenings before he had any intention of confessing it to her. She raised the matter over breakfast in January, with the particular delicacy of a woman who considered herself far too refined to raise anything bluntly, observing that the household had taken note of how much time the Duke spent at the stable of an evening, and that while she understood the animal represented a considerable investment worth protecting, the Duke's reputation for good sense was a rather more valuable asset, and ought not be spent watching a scullery maid feed bread to a horse. Julian told her with more heat than the remark strictly warranted that his evenings were his own business, and Augusta, who had raised him from the age of 10 and knew exactly how to read the heat behind a young man's temper, said nothing further at breakfast, but began from that morning forward a quiet campaign to ensure the arrangement did not continue. She spoke to Hollis about reassigning the kitchen staff's evening duties. She spoke to Mrs. Fenn about keeping a closer accounting of which girls will wear after supper. She did not forbid Elsie from the stable outright, understanding that an outright prohibition would only sharpen Julian's interest. But she made the girls' evenings steadily more difficult to steal, adding tasks that ran later, scheduling the linen inventory for the very hours Elsie had once spent at the stable, small obstacles laid with the patience of a woman who had spent decades managing a household by attrition rather than confrontation. There was also, by early spring, a more direct threat to the fragile order of things in the person of Miss Cordelia Vane, the daughter of a baron whose lands bordered the eastern edge of the Ashfell estate, and whose mother had made no secret, across 2 counties, of her ambition to see Cordelia installed as the next Duchess of Rowancross. Cordelia herself was neither cruel nor unintelligent, and in another arrangement of circumstances she and Julian might have made a perfectly amicable match built on shared interests in horses and estate management, for she rode well and spoke of crop rotation with more enthusiasm than most young ladies spoke of anything at all. But she had been raised to view marriage as a campaign to be won, rather than a bond to be discovered, and when Augusta began quietly steering invitations her way, Cordelia arrived at Ashfell for a fortnight's visit in March, with every intention of closing the matter before summer. She arrived at Ashfell with 3 trunks and a maid of her own, and settled into the guest wing with the easy familiarity of a young woman who had visited grand houses often enough to consider them a natural extension of her own. She was, by any reasonable measure, a fine match for a duke, well-read, well-mannered, capable of holding a conversation about drainage and tenant rents, without the glazed politeness other young ladies affected around such subjects. Augusta seated her beside Julian at dinner each evening, and steered the table talk, whenever it wandered, gently back toward the 2 of them, and Julian, aware of what his aunt was doing, and too well-mannered himself to object openly at his own table, answered Cordelia's questions with the careful courtesy of a man performing a duty rather than pursuing an interest. She noticed the horse first, and asked on her second afternoon whether she might see the famous widow-maker everyone in the county still spoke of in low voices, and Julian, wanting to be a reasonable host and perhaps wanting some proof for his own satisfaction of how far the animal had come, walked her down to the stable in the golden hour before supper. The horse had grown calm enough by then to be led out into the paddock on a loose line, though only ever by Elsie, and only ever with the particular unhurried patience she brought to every exchange with him. Cordelia watched from the fence as the black stallion walked beside the scullery girl, with his head low and his ears soft, an image so far from the screaming animal of the county's rumours that she laughed aloud in genuine surprise, and then, watching Julian watch the two of them, her laughter faded into something more calculating. She said nothing to Julian directly that evening. She said a great deal over the following days to Augusta, whose own suspicions had already been circling the same conclusion, and between the two women a plan formed that required no explicit conspiracy, only a shared understanding of what needed to happen and a shared willingness to make it happen through means that would never appear, on the surface, as anything other than good household management. Augusta arranged, within the week, for Elsie to be transferred from kitchen duties to a rotation at the Dower House 3 miles distant, citing a genuine shortage of staff there and framing the move as an opportunity for advancement rather than what it plainly was, a removal. Elsie learned of the transfer from Mrs. Fenn on a Thursday and understood immediately what lay beneath it, though she said nothing of her understanding aloud, having learned young that a servant who protested her own reassignment rarely improved her circumstances by protesting. She went to the stable that final evening, knowing it might be her last visit for some time, and found the horse waiting at the stall door in the way he had come to wait for her, ears pricked forward at the sound of her step long before she came into view, and she stood with him a long while in the dark, her forehead pressed briefly to the warm plane of his neck, and told him, in the low voice she had always used with him, that she did not know when she would come again, but that she had not chosen to leave. The Dower House proved a lonelier posting than she had expected, 3 miles distant and staffed by an older, quieter set of servants who kept to routines established long before Elsie's arrival, and showed little interest in altering them for a transferred kitchen girl nobody had asked for and nobody quite understood the reason for. She rose at the same hour and worked the same long days, scrubbing floors that seemed to gather dust from nowhere in a house half its residents rarely used, and in the evenings, with no stable and no stallion waiting at the end of a dark aisle, she found the hours stretching in a way they never had at Ashful. She thought often of the horse in those weeks, wondering whether he had eaten, whether the hum she had always offered him had been replaced by anything at all, and she thought, more than she wished to admit even to herself, of the low lamp light and the quiet company of a man who had never once made her feel smaller for being a servant. Julian did not learn of the transfer until the following morning. When he arrived at the stable at his usual hour and found only Hollis there, and Hollis, uncomfortable but unwilling to lie to his employer, told him plainly that the scullery girl had been sent to the Dower House on the Dowager's instruction. Julian rode to Augusta's private sitting room within the hour, and the conversation that followed was the sharpest the two of them had ever had. Julian accusing his aunt of interfering in matters that were not hers to manage, Augusta reminding him with icy precision that a duke's household was very much hers to manage until he demonstrated the judgment to manage it himself, and that judgment, in her estimation, did not currently include mooning over a scullery maid while an eligible baron's daughter sat waiting in the drawing-room with. Rather more patience than the situation deserved, Augusta pressed her advantage further before the argument closed, reminding Julian in the same icy voice that a duke's marriage was not merely a private matter of the heart, but a public instrument that either strengthened an estate or weakened it, that tenants and neighbours and distant cousins with claims of their own all watched a duke's choice of duchess for signs of the family's continued good. Judgment, and that a scullery girl, however gentle a hand with a difficult horse, brought nothing to that instrument but scandal dressed up as romance. Julian did not have an answer ready for this, not because he agreed with it, but because some old dutiful part of him recognised the shape of the argument even as the rest of him rejected its conclusion, and it was this hesitation, this single unguarded moment of doubt, that Augusta read correctly as an opening rather than a defeat. He did not have the transfer reversed that day, telling himself in the aftermath of the argument that acting rashly would only confirm every suspicion Augusta held, and that some space between himself and Elsie might in fact be wise. given how thoroughly his own thinking on the matter had ceased to resemble the composed judgment expected of him. He told himself this for 3 days. On the 4th day he rode to the dower house under the thin excuse of inspecting its roof repairs, and found Elsie in the kitchen garden there, with dirt on her hands and her cap askew. And the sight of her undid the whole careful architecture of distance he had spent 3 days constructing. They did not speak long, both of them conscious of eyes that might be watching from the dower house windows, but in the few minutes they had he told her that the horse had refused every hand but hers since her departure, would not be led, would not be groomed. Had gone 3 days without eating more than a few mouthfuls, despite every effort Hollis's men had made. He told her this not as an accusation, but as a confession, admitting that he did not know how to fix what his aunt had broken, without breaking something larger in the process. And Elsie, who had spent 3 days telling herself the same story Julian had been telling himself, that distance was wise, that a duke and a kitchen maid had no business standing as close as they had stood, felt the careful story collapse the moment she saw the worry in his face. She turned the visit over in her mind for days afterward, lying awake in the narrow dower house bed she shared with no one, trying to reason her way towards some sensible conclusion about what a duke's worried face over a horse's appetite could possibly mean for a girl with no name and no dowry and no claim on anyone's future. She told herself, on the more sensible nights, that gratitude and affection were not the same coin, that a man might value her hand with an animal without valuing anything further, and that she would do well to remember the very large distance between a stable yard where rank mattered little and a drawing room where it mattered enormously. But she remembered too the way he had looked at her that afternoon in the kitchen garden, not the way a duke looks at a useful servant, but the way a man looks at someone he has been trying, without much success, to stop thinking about, and against every sensible caution she had ever taught herself. Some stubborn and unguarded part of her would not stop hoping. She did not go back to the stable that week, understanding that a sudden reversal would draw exactly the scrutiny Augusta was waiting to pounce upon, but she wrote, in the careful hand the poorhouse schoolmaster had once beaten into her against her own expectations, a short note to Hollis explaining how the horse liked his hay laid rather than dropped, how he startled at sudden movement from his blind side, how a low hum, tuneless and constant, had always seemed to settle him faster than silence. Hollis followed her instructions with the scepticism of a man who did not entirely believe a scullery girl's methods deserved the deference of written correspondence, but he followed them nonetheless, because the alternative was a horse that grew weaker by the day. And within a week the animal was eating again, though he remained, by every groom's account, a shadow of the creature he had been under Elsie's daily hand. The matter might have continued in this uneasy stalemate through the summer, had it not been for the county hunt breakfast that Augusta insisted upon hosting at Ashfell in June, an event that drew half the gentry of the district to the estate, and that Cordelia's mother had specifically requested be scheduled to coincide with her daughter's final week of visiting, a coincidence transparent to everyone except, apparently, Julian himself, who agreed to the date without examining its convenient timing. The hunt breakfast traditionally concluded with a display of the estate's finest horses paraded before the assembled guests, a custom Edmund had always taken particular pride in, and Augusta, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate both her nephew's recovered composure and the eligibility of the young woman she had positioned beside him, insisted that the black stallion, now sufficiently recovered in the public telling of things, be included in the display as proof of the estate's continued excellence. Julian objected, knowing the horse's temperament remained fragile without Elsie's daily presence, but Augusta had already informed half the county of the display, and withdrawing it now would raise precisely the questions about the horse's condition that Julian wished most to avoid, questions that might reach back, eventually, to why the animal had faltered in the first place, and who exactly had been removed from his care. He agreed, against his own judgment, on the condition that Hollis alone would lead the horse, and that the animal would be walked rather than shown at any pace, a compromise Augusta accepted with the particular grace of a woman who had already gotten what she wanted and could afford to be generous about the details. The morning of the hunt breakfast arrived bright and unseasonably warm. The lawn before Ashfell crowded with carriages and horses and the bright coats of 24 families, come to eat and gossip and watch the county's finest specimens paraded across the grass. Long tables draped in white linen stood beneath the old oaks, laden with cold meats and fruit, and the particular abundance a household displayed when it wished to announce its continued prosperity to every neighbour invited to witness it. And Augusta moved among the guests in her best grey silk, accepting compliments with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had spent weeks orchestrating every detail toward exactly this impression of effortless excellence. Cordelia stood near Julian through the whole of the morning, with the settled satisfaction of a campaign nearing its conclusion, and Augusta moved among the guests accepting compliments on the breakfast's arrangement, with the particular pleasure of a woman who believed the larger arrangement of her nephew's future was proceeding just as smoothly. Elsie was not present. She had been given no reason to be, a dower housemaid having no business at a hunt breakfast for the gentry, and she learned of the horse's inclusion in the parade only from a stable boy sent to fetch water, who mentioned it in passing without any sense of what the news would do to the girl he told it to. She did not think through what she was doing. She left the water pail where it stood, untied her apron as she walked, and crossed the 3 miles between the dower house and Ashfell at a pace that left her breathless and her cap lost somewhere in the 2nd mile, arriving at the edge of the lawn just as Hollis led the black stallion out before the assembled crowd, the horse's neck already high and tense, his eyes already showing the white ring of an animal deciding, with each passing second among strange voices and strange smells, and none of the one presence that had ever made strangeness bearable, that the world in front of him had once again become a thing to fear. Hollis had argued against the display until the very last possible morning, telling Augusta plainly that the stallion had eaten poorly since the girl's transfer, and could not be trusted around strange voices and strange horses, but Augusta had waved the objection aside with the particular confidence of a woman who had decided the story she wished to tell about her household, and did not care to hear evidence against it. Hollis led the horse out onto the lawn that morning with a tightness in his own chest that he recognised uneasily as fear. The same fear he had once felt leading the animal to its very first stall a year before, and he found himself wishing, with a suddenness that surprised him, that the scullery girl he had once dismissed as foolish were standing beside him instead of 3 miles distant at the dower house. The horse reared as Hollis reached the centre of the display lawn, close enough to the gathered families that 3 separate mothers pulled their children back with sharp cries, and Hollis, caught between the rope and his own instinct to retreat, lost his footing and fell hard onto the grass, the lead line torn from his grip. The stallion came down from the rear with his full weight and spun, ears flat, nostrils wide, every line of him gathered into the coiled violence the county had spent a year insisting was his only true nature, and the crowd surged backward as one body, screams rising, a man shouting for someone to fetch a gun, Augusta's face gone the colour of old paper as she watched. In front of every family whose good opinion she had spent years cultivating, the exact catastrophe she had assured everyone was impossible. Julian moved toward the horse without thinking, the way a man moves toward a fire before calculating whether he can survive it, but he was 30 feet distant and closing too slowly, and it was Elsie, arriving at the edge of the lawn at that precise and impossible moment, breathless and bare-headed and utterly indifferent to the 24 pairs of gentry eyes suddenly fixed upon her, who called his name across the open grass in the low steady voice she had used with him through every evening of the past winter, a voice that cut through the screaming and the panic the way a single true note cuts through noise. For one long suspended moment, nothing in the whole crowded lawn moved at all. The men who had scrambled backward stood frozen where they had stopped, the mothers still gripping their children's shoulders, the cold meats and the white linen, and the whole bright ordinary morning holding its breath around the black shape of a horse who had, a moment before, seemed ready to tear the day apart. Even the wind seemed to have gone still, or perhaps it was only that every ear on the lawn had narrowed to the single sound of a girl's voice calling a name across the grass, the way a held breath narrows a room to the one thing it is waiting for. The horse's head came around at the sound of it. He stood for one full second with his whole body still coiled to run, ears swivelling toward the voice, and then, in front of 24 witnesses who would speak of the moment for the rest of their lives, the animal the county had named the Widowmaker walked directly across the open lawn toward a bare-headed scullery girl in a torn apron, ignoring the men who scrambled backward from his path, ignoring the shouted warnings, ignoring everything in the world except the one sound he had learned. Across a long winter, to trust above every other, he stopped in front of her with his sides heaving and his great head lowered until it hung level with her own, and when she raised her hand, slow and open, to touch the ragged white patch above his eye, he folded his front legs beneath him and knelt on the grass at her feet, his whole enormous body sinking down before her the way a subject kneels before something it has decided, once and for all, to trust. The silence that followed was total. 24 guests who had come to a hunt breakfast to eat cold meats and admire fine horses stood instead in stunned witness to a scene none of them had words for. A kitchen maid with dirt still under her fingernails standing over a kneeling stallion twice her weight, her hand resting against his cheek, her voice still murmuring the low tuneless hum that had settled him through 100 evenings no one but Julian had ever seen. Cordelia, standing near the front of the crowd, understood before anyone spoke a single further word exactly what she was looking at, and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman whose campaign has just met an obstacle no strategy could overcome, that whatever chance she had once possessed had ended in the space of that single kneeling moment. Julian crossed the lawn at last, slow now, no longer racing toward danger, but walking toward something he had spent a year circling, without permitting himself to name. He stopped beside Elsie and the still kneeling horse, and he did not lower his voice for the crowd's benefit, did not soften what he was about to say into something more easily dismissed as gratitude toward a servant who had prevented an accident. He said, in a voice that carried across the whole silent lawn, that the horse had chosen his keeper months ago, and every soul at Ashfell had simply been too slow or too proud to notice, and that he did not intend, whatever his aunt's opinion or the county's expectation, to remain slow or proud about the matter any longer. He asked her, in front of Augusta and Cordelia and 24 families who would carry the story to every corner of the county within the week, whether she would consent to stand beside him not as a servant borrowed for an evening's convenience, but as the woman he intended to marry, and Elsie, still kneeling with her hand against the horse's cheek, and her heart beating hard enough that she felt, certain the whole lawn must hear it, answered him with a simple word that the horse seemed to feel through the ground before the crowd fully registered it, and the stallion, as though satisfied that the matter had been settled to his liking, rose to his feet beside her, with none of the violence the county had once feared, only a great slow unfolding, black and steady, like a shadow finally permitted to stand in the sun. Augusta did not speak for the whole of the ride back into the house that afternoon, and when she finally did, days later, it was not to apologize, for apology was not a language Augusta had ever learned fluently, but to observe, with the dry precision that was as close as she came to warmth, that she supposed a woman capable of gentling the Widowmaker might prove capable of a great many things a household required, and that she would not stand in the way of an arrangement the horse himself had apparently already approved. Cordelia left for her father's estate within the week, her mother's ambitions quietly folded away and never spoken of again in Julian's presence, though she left with rather more grace than the circumstances required, remarking privately to her own maid on the carriage ride home that a woman who could not compete with a kneeling horse had perhaps been fighting the wrong battle from the very start. The county, for its part, spent the whole of the following season telling the story of the hunt breakfast to anyone who had not already heard it, embellishing it a little further with each telling, the horse growing larger and the moment more miraculous with every repetition, until the tale of the kitchen girl and the kneeling stallion had become, in the way such stories do, less a piece of local gossip and more a piece of local legend told at firesides long after the families who had witnessed it firsthand had themselves grown old. Elsie and Julian married in the autumn in the small chapel at Ashfell rather than the grand cathedral in the county town that Augusta had initially proposed, a choice Elsie made, and Julian supported without hesitation, wanting the day to belong to the two of them and not to the county's appetite for spectacle. The horse stood in the paddock beside the chapel through the whole ceremony, led there by Hollis at Elsie's request, and left to graze within sight of the small gathered crowd, and more than one guest remarked afterward that the animal had lifted his great dark head at the precise moment the vows were spoken, as though he understood, in whatever way a horse understands anything, that something important had been settled, and that he had played no small part in the settling of it. The years that followed settled into their own quiet rhythm, the kind neither of them had dared to hope for in the uncertain months before the hunt breakfast. Elsie learned the running of a great household not through any formal instruction, but through the same patient attentiveness she had once brought to a frightened animal, watching how rooms wanted to be kept, how tenants wanted to be heard, how a house long weighted with grief could be coaxed, gradually and without force, back toward warmth. Augusta, true to her word, never apologized for the transfer to the Dower house, but she took to seeking Elsie's opinion on household matters with increasing frequency as the years passed, a habit that was, in its own dry way, the closest thing to an apology the Dowager Duchess had ever offered anyone. Julian found that the ease he had once felt only in the stable at evening had spread, slowly, into the rest of his days, into estate meetings and tenant disputes, and the long quiet suppers the two of them shared once the household had gone to bed, until the composed, contained bearing the county had once called cold became, in the retelling, simply the bearing of a man who had finally been given reason to be steady rather than merely efficient. They named him Ash after the estate that had nearly destroyed him and had, in the end, given him back to himself. He never became a gentle horse in the way the term is generally understood, never lost the wary alertness that had kept him alive through a year of fear and misunderstanding, but he settled, over the years that followed, into a creature capable of trust, capable even of a rough, ungainly affection that he showed to almost no one but the two people who had refused to give up on him when giving up would have been so very much easier. Julian rode him through the estate each morning for the whole of his long life, and Elsie, who became in time exactly the kind of duchess the county had never expected and never quite knew what to make of, walked out to the paddock most evenings still, long after the last cold winter that had first brought her to his stall, and stood with her hand against the ragged white patch above his eye, and hummed the same low tuneless note that had once, on a night when the whole world had seemed determined to prove itself unworthy of trust, taught a frightened animal that the next hand reaching toward him did not have to be feared. Their children, 3 of them born across the decade that followed, grew up believing the story of the kneeling horse the way other children grow up believing fairy tales, half certain it could not have happened exactly as told, and half certain, watching Ash lower his great greying head for their mother each evening, that it must have happened precisely so. The eldest, a daughter with her mother's stillness and her father's watchful eyes, took to spending her own evenings in the stable before she was old enough to properly be trusted there, sitting on the very bucket her mother had once claimed, and Elsie, watching her from the doorway more than once, felt the whole shape of her own history folding gently back upon itself. The poorhouse girl who had once sat alone in the dark, now watching her own child learn the same patient lesson, that the frightened and the overlooked, given time enough and one steady hand willing to wait, could always be coaxed back toward trust. The village at the bottom of the drive told the story still, decades on, to travellers who stopped at the inn and asked why the great house on the hill kept a stallion long past his working years grazing in the paddock nearest the chapel, rather than the working stables, and the innkeeper, who had been a boy on the lawn that June morning, told it each time with the same reverence of a horse the whole county had feared, and a kitchen girl nobody had thought to notice, and of the single moment, brief and enormous, when the one had knelt before the other in front of everyone and changed, in the space of a breath, exactly what everyone had believed themselves certain of. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.